Dean Ault, thanks for being with us today and for giving the students an opportunity to hear from someone who's experienced the very issues that we've talked about for the last 6 weeks. The first question has to do with the behavior of death row inmates. The student states, "I've always heard that death row inmates are some of the best inmates to work with. Is this true? And if so, what accounts for this?"
It's not necessarily true. Of course, the death row inmates are very isolated. They're in single cells in most systems, so they don't have a lot of opportunities to misbehave. But they come in all sizes and shapes and all types of intelligence levels. Some of them are psychopathic. Some of them are in for first-time offenses. So, they murdered one person, and some of them have killed several people. So when Charlie Manson was on death row, he wasn't a nice person then, and he is not a nice person now. I saw a few at Florence, the Oklahoma City bomber. He was a very arrogant, and the staff described him as an arrogant asshole, and not pleasant to work with. I did get to know quite a few of the death row inmates. The first two that I executed had been in for 17 years. They came in when they were 17 years old, and we executed them when they were 34. I knew them when they first came in, and I was a warden. And then years later, as Commissioner of Corrections, I had to execute them. They were totally different people.
Which execution methods have you had experience with, and is any one more cruel and unusual than the other?
In 2 states that I was commissioner, they used the gas chamber, and I never had to execute anybody. I do remember, ironically, that we replaced the sealant in the gas chamber. It cost $25,000 in both states to do that. But the one that was legal when I executed about 14 people, I've forgotten the exact number, which I still remember faces, a lot of them, but I don't remember how many. But it was the electric chair, and it's pretty dramatic. I'm very familiar with lethal injection. I've been in several states and watched them go through the procedure, not killing somebody, but how they administered it and what the steps were. Georgia, which did use the electric chair, is now lethal injection. I took a group of professors there a couple of years ago from all over the country. They'd never been to death row, even though one of them was lectured here on the death penalty. And they gave us a demonstration of how that operates. That's probably much more humane in that the first thing they inject is a muscle relaxer, and then something like Valium that really puts them at ease and puts them at sleep, and then they put the lethal dosage in so that the individual doesn't experience any pain that we're aware of. But it's still difficult on the people that have to administer it.
That leads me right into the next question is what effect does having to administer the death penalty have on institutional staff?
It's ironic that I took the Attorney General with me to the executions. We could have stayed in Atlanta, but my philosophy was that I wouldn't ask staff to do something I wouldn't do. And he handled it by running for governor and talk about being tough on crime. He used to ride with me, and then later he would have his publicist ride with him, and they'd stop and talk to the press. before we went in, and then when we left, and just to show him he was tough on crime, like a lot of politicians do. But most of the staff, including the warden and myself, I realized at one time we were giving psychological help to all the staff that participated. And then I realized, except for myself and the Attorney General, then I realized I was suffering pretty badly about it. Because you have to understand, it is the most premeditated murder. I mean, the book on the procedure is about 2 inches thick. We were behind the chair. There was a wall separating, and there was a glass that the Attorney General and I looked out. The phones back there were hooked to the U.S. Supreme Court, Georgia Supreme Court, the governor's office. And after, sometimes we'd get a call, and it was stayed, sometimes for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes for 2 weeks. But you were very up close and personal on all of them. You talked to the inmates before they were executed. You gave them an opportunity to say their last words. I remember one tried to make a filibuster out of it, and I had to stop him and proceed with the execution. I finally, I went to a psychologist to get some help, even though I am one. But it is extremely difficult for somebody with a conscience, somebody who has some ethics. And, I used to get volunteers that, they'd write me that they'd want to execute. They were electricians or something. But I didn't want a sadist to execute. I wanted somebody that cared about human beings, if we had to do it. But as far as I could tell, everybody suffered. And I still get flashbacks. It stays with you.
Long lasting. What was the number one priority for you as a commissioner on the day of the execution?
It was, you had to deal with several different things. One, you went down to the prison, and there was always outside, this ironically was the prison where I was warden. It's a supermax prison. This was in the early 70s, and I was executing people in the early 2000s. But when you go down, then there's a group outside for executions and always a group against, and then the whole media corps is there. And then when you go in the institution, you have to deal with the witnesses, and we had them in a room, had to talk to the witnesses. And this isn't true in all states, but I didn't want the victims' families to be a witness. I wanted it to be as professional as it could. Didn't want it seen as some sort of act of vengeance. But you had the families in a room at the other end of the corridor in the prison and administration building. And we had chaplains with them. But when you're working with the witnesses, and we fed the witnesses, and there was a lot of uneasiness and nervous tension and nervous laughter. And sometimes that would carry down the hallway to where the victims' families were. So you had to go down and talk with them also. And then you had to go to the death chamber and make sure that everything was in order. We had built a new death chamber on the backside of the prison. So you got in a car and went all the way around to the rear gate, and then went to the death chamber. We had a gigantic generator. The first thing I did after the first execution was move that a considerable distance away because it was making so much noise it was difficult to hear in the death chamber. But to make sure that everything was in order and that whatever we did would not be like in Florida where the hair caught on fire or whatever, that the apparatus was set up correctly. And we didn't want to make a circus out of it. So that took quite a bit of time. And then they ushered the witnesses in, and then it was a matter of waiting till all the clearances were received from the courts or the governor's office. And then when the Attorney General told me everything was clear, then I'd give the order to execute. The executioner stood behind me, and he was the electrician when I was the warden. And he dealt with it by just seeing it as an electrical process. He never looked at the inmate and just threw the switches. And then he always had a physician on hand that when it was over, after you gave them their last words, and then they threw the switch, and you watched. There was always a tremendous jolt in the body, and it's still hard.
I bet it is. I bet.
But then the physician examines and certifies the individual as deceased. Then the body's moved into an autopsy room right next to the execution chamber, and an autopsy is done. And normally my vehicle would follow the hearse out. I never stopped to talk to the press, either going in or going out. And again, this wasn't about me, it was about the process. And it made for a long day and even longer night.
Sounds like you spent a lot of your time with the offender's family and the victim's family. Did you get any sense ever from the victim's family as to their feelings after it was over?
A lot of time it was sometimes it was a sense of relief and closure. But sometimes they would tell me it really didn't solve their problem. They didn't get the relief they thought they might.
One of the students was curious, and it kind of stems from what you were just referencing about how it affected you and the staff, but they were curious as to whether or not you reflected on the executions with which you were involved. That is, do you view whether what they did was right or wrong, and whether the death penalty was right or wrong? Or did you carry out an execution as part of your job?
It was part of my official duties, but yes, I thought about it a lot. At one time, I thought I could justify it. I mean, it was the law. And that if death penalty really did deter, at least saved one victim, maybe it would be worth it. I always remember a case before we had the death penalty legally again of an inmate telling me that he had robbed a country store and tied up the man and woman, and then was driving down the road and began to think what he would get for robbery or what he would get for murder, and the chances of getting caught with the victims there to testify. And he turned the car around and went back and killed them. And so I always had that sort of example in my mind as maybe a justification. I don't think there's any research that ever said that it acts as a deterrent. And then some people say, well, yeah, well, it deterred that individual, but so would have life imprisonment. And some people say it's cheaper. It isn't. It costs, at the time I was doing it, it was well over $1 million to execute somebody after all the court costs were paid. So it was much more expensive, but and of course, all the Western European countries and Canada, they don't execute anymore. They really believe they are civilized. I have a hard time believing that using premeditated murder and violence is a way to model behavior that would deter somebody else from doing it. As Marion Barry once said in Washington, we don't have any crime up here at all except for the gun violence. Well, and you debate all this in your mind, and you have to, at one time, decide whether you can continue to do this. I decided I couldn't.
Is there anything that you would change about the death penalty that would, the processes, how it's administered, that would make it more palatable, more morally acceptable?
As far as I know now on the process that most states are using, I mean, Utah still lets you either shoot them or hang them, and the inmate has the choice. But lethal injection is certainly much more humane than the gas chamber, which, if you ever read John Gresham's The Chamber, you'll understand how gruesome that is. And certainly execution was gruesome.
What do you think the future holds in terms of, Supreme Court rulings that we keep, juveniles are now excluded, mentally retarded are excluded? Do you think that speaks of abolishment?
I wish that meant that, but I don't believe that. There's so much more tied up into our executions. A lot of it's very racial, and a lot of it's the stereotyping for a lot of whites, a black rapist, fears along that line. Most of the Western European countries and Canada, the populations are, and many of the states that don't have execution have much more homogeneous populations. And so the racial fears are not involved in the decision to have a death penalty in a state. And we're still in there, because I was just talking to a legislator last week about, why don't we really do something about our sentencing laws? We can't afford this. This is absurd. And somebody I respect, and he said, you can't do it, get reelected. You can't appear to be soft on crime, even though absolutely it's the most realistic thing to do. So as long as that philosophy holds, I think we'll have executions with it for quite some time, at least in my lifetime. And that's very unfortunate, I think.
Anything else do you want to address?
I know that I'm not the only one who has administered executions that feel the same way that I do. Don Cabana, who executed many at Parchment in Mississippi. Morris Thigpen, who executed several people in Alabama. I can rattle off several other names. They all have shed a lot of tears. Something doesn't